Welcome back to those of you who've been here before, and to those who haven't, welcome to Narrative Worlds. Thank you for being here. I'm your host, Kate Elliott. The goal of this series, which is happening once a month, is to dig into the idea of narrative worlds and the theory and practice of building them. So each month, a guest joins me for a dialogue on a specific aspect of world building. And we'll talk for about 40 minutes, and there'll be space for questions at the end of the hour. And I do urge you to ask questions. You could use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I won't be looking at chat. I don't think Ken will be looking at chat either, but Nathan will. I'll close the hour by mentioning forthcoming dates, guests, and topics. Standard disclaimer. This series is not about a goal or a lesson. It is a discussion by professionals about their experience. There's no right answer or secret handshake. If you hear something that's useful for you, that's fantastic. And if not, that's also par for the course. So, having said that, let me introduce today's fabulous guest, Ken Liu. He is the author of multiple award-winning short fiction and has two collections out, the Paper Menagerie. I know. The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, and The Hidden Girl and Other Stories, as well as the epic fantasy Dandelion Dynasty, which will be 4 books. The first book is The Grace of Kings, and the third and fourth novels are complete and will be coming out later this year. Ken has also done a lot of translation work and is the editor of 3 anthologies? Two anthologies of Chinese science fiction in translation. Ken, and Ken, add whatever you want.
Not a whole lot. I guess people who don't know me outside of the writing context probably don't know that I spent much of my life as a technologist, hence today's topic, and also as a lawyer. And actually a lot of my work currently still involves technology, thinking about technology and futurism in particular. So besides writing books, that actually tends to be the biggest part of my work, just thinking about and speculating on technology and talking to people about how to think about technology and the future. And some of that I'll weave into today's discussion as we talk.
So when I asked Ken if he would be on, he said yes, because why would anyone say no to me? And I said, what do you want to talk about? And instantly, Ken, you said, I'd like to talk about technology, and you even had a title for the talk. So go on.
Okay. So this is my little pet theory about technology, which has helped me a lot in terms of thinking about technology and also in telling stories about technology. And I think the way that they're helpful isn't just in science fiction, but actually a lot of times in fantasy. I mean, my epic fantasy is very much about technology. The way I pitched it originally was the Dandelion Dynasty is about a world in which engineers played the role of wizards in traditional epic fantasy, and that the way the engineers think about their work is the way poets think about their work. That was my original pitch. So this is what, thank you. So this is what I'm gonna try to talk to you about. I think a lot of times when we talk about technology in world building or as part of speculative fiction, we tend to obsess over the technical aspects. You know, is this a plausible extrapolation? Is this based on historical precedent? That sort of thing is fun and interesting, and you know, it requires a lot of work. But I don't think that's what makes technology interesting speculative fiction. And I don't think it's what helps you to tell a good story. I think the way to approach technology as part of world building and as part of narrative construction is to think about technology as an aspect of storytelling in the following sense. My theory is that human beings are unable to process the world in the form of pure facts. Facts and figures don't actually move us, and they don't really help us think in any fundamental way. If you think about something that really matters to you, whether it's love or faith, or kindness, fairness, justice, what have you, you're not going to be, if you think about it, just take 30 seconds or so to really think about what those words mean to you. You're not going to really think about them in terms of fundamental philosophical commitments. You really won't be thinking about them in terms of facts and figures about allocation of resources or anything like that. What will actually end up coming to your mind are these stories, either stories from your personal experience or stories from that you've read, that you've experienced, you've heard, what have you, fables, if you will, myth, if you will, that really define these abstract words for you. We don't understand the world through abstractions. We understand the world through stories. So, the way you think about love isn't going to be based on some abstraction. It's going to be the way you were loved. The way you think about courage isn't an abstract idea, but a specific story about someone who was courageous, who inspires you. The same thing with technology. I think the way to think about technology is to think about what stories involve technology and how you understand technology. So, one example, right? So in the current world, one of the topics that folks who are working technology think a lot about is the notion of privacy. What does it mean to build privacy into social media platforms? What does it mean to build privacy into your Internet of Things products? And the reason why so much of the discussion seems to be nonsense is because privacy is too abstract a word. The way people understand privacy is through specific stories that illustrate for them what privacy means. If your notion of privacy is deeply founded on some notion of your experience as a marginalized person and the threats that you face as a result of your information being put out there for the mob, if you will, your idea of privacy is very, very different. The story that motivates you to think about privacy is very different from the story that someone from a position of privilege who says, well, if you didn't do anything wrong, why would you be afraid? That kind of attitude is motivated by a very different set of stories. They same thing with something like free speech. The reason people have so much discussion and fighting over free speech, and I won't allude to any specific events, but your attitude towards things like political violence is very much based on the stories that actually motivate you, the mythology that underlie your understanding of words like democracy, vociferous debate, rationality, free speech. These are not abstract words for which we share an understanding. We have different stories, and that is where all the difference comes from. Technology is like that. So the way you think about privacy in technology has to do with the stories that motivate it. So the way I think about technology is when you're trying to do world building through technology, think about what are the stories that people are telling themselves? What are the stories motivating them? Because stories are what drives people to participate in technology in the first place. We use technology as a way to tell stories about ourselves, to explain who we are, as well as to enact the mythologies we believe in technology. So for example, again, take the modern world as an example. Technology, high tech, or Silicon Valley is one of the most attractive places for people to work. If you have the skills or believe that you have the skills, many people who do it actually are not suited for that world at all. But if you believe you have the technology, you have the skills for it, and you go into Silicon Valley, what tends to motivate you is not actually money. And this is somewhat confusing for people who are not in the tech industry. If you want to make money, there are many much more lucrative ways to do so. If you have the talent to make it in Silicon Valley, you can do it in many other places. But what really Silicon Valley will bring to you that nowhere else can bring you, at least that's the story we tell ourselves, is the amount of power you can exert on the world. Yeah. Okay, the modern mythology about technology in Silicon Valley is if you have a soldering iron and know how to code, and you have your keyboard with you, you potentially can come up with an idea and implement it. You can write some incantation into the machine and make this thing real such that you can transform the lives of billions of people. You can build a Facebook and transform the way politics is conducted around the world. You can bring down governments. You can initiate coups. You can control speech. You can change the world, fundamentally transform it. You can make something that you believe, a value you're committed to, you can make that value the faith of the world through technology. There is nothing else that will allow you to do that. You can be the president of the United States and you can't even have as much power as a geek in the right place with the right technology. That is what motivates a lot of people, that power, that ability to change the world, to fundamentally make a dent in the universe. Now, the reality, of course, is most people who go into technology don't do anything like that. What they end up doing is figure out ways to sell other people more ads. But nonetheless, the interesting thing about technology is that's the story that moves so many of us into the tech world, this idea that we can change the world. When the reality is most of us don't get to do anything like that. We do something much less glamorous and in fact much more ethically problematic.
Ken, somehow, I'm sorry, finish, and then because I have a
okay
thing.
So the fact that there is a gap between the story, the myth that motivated you, and the reality of what keeps you going is also itself an interesting story. So the example I'm giving you is this is the story that people tell themselves as technologists. And this is not unique to us. Think about the story that motivated technologists back in the time of the Industrial Revolution. Think about the technology myth that motivated people in pre-industrial times, when there were a lot of literal myth about very skilled craftspeople, artisans. The artisanal story of technology is very different from the I'm going to change the world with the keyboard story of technology. But the fact that technologists of different eras have different stories about what it is they do is deeply important, interesting. And in fact, if you're familiar with the history of science, Thomas Kuhn has this whole idea about the paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts happen all the time in technology. The kind of stories that people want to tell about technology, the kind of stories they want to think about, the kind of problems they think are solvable by technology changes all the time. And sometimes it's based on paradigm shifts. The fact that, so many manufacturers are now coming out with smart devices and Internet of Things is an example of that. This is a paradigm shift. This is an overarching background story to which all of us are trying to contribute, but it doesn't mean that this is the only way. I'll have a lot more to say about aspects of this, but to me, what has always helped me when writing speculative fiction is to think about what is the overall story that technologists are trying to tell themselves. What is the story that is being told by the technology? There are stories about technology, stories told through technology, stories told with technology, and all of it has to fit. All of it has to come together. It's not actually about the machines. In fact, the machines are the least interesting part. It's all the human stories that motivate us to devote ourselves to machines that matters. Anyway, Kate, that was my little opening.
No, that was, and that's perfectly segues into something that we had when we just talked a little bit about what we were going to say earlier this week. I can't, time has no meaning anymore because my technology, anyway, which is, the question is, what is technology? How are we defining it? And I wanted to give an example, actually, from my own work, which I rarely do. Anyway, because as a fan, I've written both science fiction and fantasy, and I've noticed over time that the focus on technology so often tends to be on modern technology, industrial revolution, post-industrial evolution, modern things. And that it's like, oh, in the Middle Ages, there was no innovation, people didn't have machines, all of which is not true. Because of this story we tell ourselves about what technology is and what I mean, literally what we can call a form of a technology. And so I wanted to give this an example in the third book of the Crown of Stars series. The character she's a courier for the king. And this is set in a kind of a 10th century continent, alternate Germanic setting. And it's not, so she's a courier for the king, which means that she has, some kind of a writ from the king that allows her to ride theoretically unmolested by ordinary people, not by rebels, obviously, or bandits, to carry a message somewhere. So at some point, she comes to an old growth forest, which let's just say is kind of long and thin. So to go all the way around it would take an extra 2 weeks. But sometime earlier than her arriving there, the king had a road cut through the narrow part of the forest. So she can take that road and take, 2 weeks off her journey. So she gets about halfway through where there's a small village in the middle of the forest whose remit, who has a charter from the king that allows them, that says, you will be the king's servants, only the king's servants, not a lord's servants, as long as you keep this road clear for the king's business. So when she gets there and stays over the night, they ask her they have this charter carefully sealed away. They ask her to read it to them because it happened probably some decades earlier. And I don't want to talk just briefly about how much technology is in this sequence that people would often not identify technology. One, there's roads. That's a form of technology. There's communications and the idea that people are going to communicate across distances if they can't, like we are right now. There's a charter and a legal system, both to give her safe passage, to have people feed her and house her when she stops for the night. And that has given this village the freedom to not be under a lord's rule, but to only be under the king's rule, which was something, if it was a good king, could be a benefit to them. And finally, of course, her literacy, that she can read this charter to them, none of whom are literate. And so that's just there is 4 pieces of technology that in fantasy are often not seen as technology. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, fantasy is especially interesting to me because obviously if you write fantasy that involves, either the present or future levels of technology, then the technology is obvious. But a lot of times fantasy is set in pseudo, ancient times or alternate timeline in which the technology, quote unquote, tree has taken a different set of branches than ours. I don't like the word technology tree because I think the idea of tree is deeply it has a hierarchical and the notion of higher level, lower level that actually isn't really all that true. Technology, if you study the history of technology, you realize that the way we sequence things is just unique to our experience. It's really not, there's nothing inherently that says that you have to discover X before Y and so on and so forth. So the way I think about technology is it's not so much a tree as a helix of sorts. There are ways in which you sort of go over the same ground multiple times at different levels. And it doesn't even have to be a helix that goes up, it might go down. But anyway, so to focus specifically on fantasy and technology, what I like to get people to think about is, you know, the machines are the most obvious kinds of technology, and there is actually a lot of wonderful uh, classical ancient technology that if you're interested in writing historical fantasy or fantasy that's based on a time frame that's before the present, you can research into, and it's fascinating because the technologies of the past, much like technology of the present, tells a story about the people who invented the technology and who used it. So different cultures have different technology vocabularies. They rely on materials that are unique to their environment. They develop technology to serve ends that are unique to their culture. They use technology to the way they think about invention and the way they think about innovation and the way they think about how to build on what has come before, how to join in the grand epic that is a culture's technology achievement are different. And it's fascinating to delve into the past and find out how did, various cultures, pre-modern cultures, tell coherent stories about themselves using their technology. But one particular way in which you can think about technology that isn't very obvious is the technology of what I call collective decision making or social technology. These are things that are used to solve human social problems, and they're not always explicitly talked about as technology, but they are. So a shorthand for that is to think about technology in the way that lawyers think about technology. And I was a lawyer, so I can say this. So my specialty when I was in law school was in administrative law, which is often thought of as one of the most boring parts of the law, but it's actually deeply fascinating if you're a technologist. Administrative law deals with the set of rules and regulations that control what administrative agencies can do. And it's a fascinating area because it's basically technology of bureaucracies, okay? So all modern societies, no matter if they're authoritarian states or wonderful direct democracy, what have you, they share a feature in which is they rely on bureaucracies to do their work. The day-to-day work of actual administration is conducted by bureaucracies. And bureaucracies present a perpetual problem for human societies from time immemorial. You have a professional administrative class. How do you ensure that they're actually serving the people they're supposed to serve as opposed to serve themselves? How do you prevent administrative agencies from just making themselves bigger and gobbling up more budgets? Because, anybody who has worked in any kind of bureaucracy knows that this is human nature. Administrative agencies will never ask for a smaller budget. They will always invent things for themselves to do. They will always want to hire more people. They will never be efficient. They will always come up with excuses for why things cannot be done. They will always try to grow their own power and try to get outside of the limits of why it's set up in the first place, so on and so forth.
And I want to just put in here, when people complain about bureaucracy, when you get a complex society, how can complex societies function without them? Probably not.
You can.
Yeah.
You can.
So it's
yes.
that,
They themselves are a technology invented to solve the problem of how do you efficiently govern, and nonetheless they present here. So throughout time immemorial, people have tried over and over again to invent new technologies to control bureaucracy. So, in our society, it's a set of precedents, it's a set of principles, the Chevron deference, if you're a lawyer, that's what all that is about. Like, how much degree of deference should courts give to administrative agencies? How much can courts step in to rein in rogue agencies? How much power do presidents really have to fire agency heads and to transform agencies? How much power can Congress really go in there and change the way agencies conduct their business? We think of these as uniquely, our own problems, but they're not. They're analogs to problems that have been plaguing human beings forever. So you can go back to
this is why
Roman
you
times.
had me read Jonathan Spence's Treason by the Book, which is a
Right.
fantastic story about bureaucracy.
This is endlessly fascinating. You go back to see how other empires have dealt with bureaucracies. How did the Roman Empire effectively collect taxes? What was their way of doing this? How do they, prevent corruption from gobbling up all the tax revenues? How do pre-Columbian empires solve the same problem? What exactly? It turns out that these technological problems are common to all human societies, and you can go back and see other solutions that societies have come up with. And I feel like when you're a fantasy writer, especially if you're not into the machines, then this aspect of technology is deeply fascinating to think about the political technologies and what people have invented. Do you unleash a team of internal spies to watch over the bureaucracy? Some empires have done that. Do you give people the power to sue bureaucrats, to bring them before the king's court? Some societies have opted for that kind of solution. There are all kinds of interesting things that people have done, and to me, it's just deeply, just intensely fascinating to go back and see this. It's almost like looking at old patent databases for, administrative law concepts, and I constantly get inspired to think about just how we can still continue to learn from the wisdom nations, let alone our fantasy heroes.
Well, and in addition, I think this is absolutely this idea of social technology being recognized as technology and not just this cultural governmental thing, which is somehow set aside. It reminds me of this. I mentioned this before. Sometimes fantasy writers are accused of loving monarchy and being regressive, people who like authoritarianism, but you could argue that that people who write a fantasy novel set in a time like this are just merely putting the correct technology into the story they're writing.
Yes.
And I think that's as good a reason you're not going to have smartphones in 10th century Germany, unless there's some science fictional element, because people would go, why are they using a smartphone? So why would you? But the other thing is that people don't always think about is that ancient societies aren't rigid. There were all kinds of things, amazing things going on the margins. You might have in 10th century Germany, you might have a city on the coast of what is now Belgium that said, we're a free city, we don't pay the king, right? And then, 50 years later, a strong enough king comes in and says, oh, yes, you do, and conquers them, right? But for a time, they were involved in a more, I don't want to say democratic, but in a different form of government and a different form of self-regulating that worked for their small area. But the other thing about technology that I want to talk about, because I grew up in farm country in Oregon, is how important I think that talking about farming and agriculture and domesticated animals, indeed any form of food creation and food gathering as technology. When you can look at settlement patterns being different between like the 9th and 11th century in Europe, settlement patterns changed because they developed a new plow that could cut into the heavy, thick soil, the river soil, which was too heavy for the earlier plow, which was developed in the Mediterranean where they had lighter topsoil. So settlement patterns change. People can now move down into areas that they couldn't use for agriculture in the same way before. And that creates a whole set of new land is opened up for people to live in. It creates these large scale and medium scale changes, and also gives opportunities for people who can maybe say, well, I don't have to live here anymore because I can go live over there, and they can get away from something they might not have liked. And so, and you can see this as well in science fiction, the ways technology allow people to alter their circumstances because of changes that maybe we don't necessarily, as writers in the US, perhaps in some ways, don't always perceive as part of social change.
Yep. Well, okay, what you said there also brought to mind two particular things I want to bring up. One is, it goes back to my earlier point about technology is always part of storytelling. It's part of an overarching fundamental story that a society is telling themselves. And so, part of my big thing is foundational mythologies, and how different cultures and different peoples have very different foundational mythologies that define who they are to themselves and how they're different from other societies. Anybody who's, a contemporary American knows that part of the current tumult in the country is over this definition of what is actually the American story. We're fighting over it. That's exactly the point. But here's the thing. These overarching foundational stories play out in the vision of technology that is being played out too. And you have to be careful not to attribute one society's foundational mythology into the story for everyone else. So for example, America's technological development has been deeply influenced by our history of appropriating large swaths of land from the indigenous peoples. And so that history influences the way we think about technology. A society founded on manifest destiny and the idea of cheap land that can be taken just like that has a very different notion about technology. The amount of energy and space we've developed to parking lots, for example, is not possible in all societies. There are some places with a different history of development and a different history that just will not allow that. The technology path we've taken of the automobile being the center of modern American identity of mobility, of independence, and the way our cities, the most important feature of our cities are parking lots. That is not really how, that should not be thought of as universal. It's determined uniquely by our history and our set of circumstances.
And I think it is almost peculiarly American.
Yes.
Maybe to some extent Canadian as well. I don't know. I'm not Canadian, but yeah.
I also think it's very interesting that, if you talk to American elites, there's almost an unquestioned belief in the power of growth to solve all problems. I see this all the time among individuals from all ends of the political spectrum in America, who basically agree that the solution to all problems is to promote growth. If you think injustice is an issue, if you think inequality is an issue, if you think poverty is an issue, well, just promote growth. The reason why things are bad is because there's not enough development and growth. So grow, this leads to a belief in late capitalism's, idea that attachments are bad, community roots are bad. The best citizen is one who is a package of skills, a human resource who can be freely allocated anywhere in the world to maximize productivity. It's a deeply inhumane view of human life.
Yeah.
But we've all sort of bought into it. You can sort of see the way politicians talk about jobs being the most important thing. Why the hell is jobs the most important thing? The reason jobs are important in the sense is only because you think that this is the best way to deliver money to people. But this is so bizarre, our obsession with quote unquote jobs. Who cares what kind of jobs it is, as long as they're jobs and give people money? That's all we care about.
And the idea that the US has that they mock, there's a part of this narrative that mocks community. I mean, deliberately and specifically mocks the idea of community.
Yes, and also you can see the many social commentary written on this that basically blames poverty and so on communities. The idea that
Yeah,
some cultures
yeah.
are bad, inherently bad. There's just a huge amount of this kind of racially oriented language that is very much about a peculiar view of what is a desirable foundational story. But the point is, when you have that as the overarching story, then your view of technology is very different. You're going to gear people to think towards technology as serving a particular end, technology that promotes the vision of individual human beings as interchangeable packages of skills for the capitalist machine. That story leads to a certain view of what technologies are desirable. It leads to the promotion of single family housing. It leads to the belief that the solution for traffic is to build more roads. It leads to the belief that promoting home ownership is the only thing that the government should do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are
That you
all
should pave
technological.
over agricultural land. That's happening here right now on an island that only
Island,
produces,
right?
on an island that only produces 15% of its own food. They're paving over some of the best agricultural land for single family homes. It's
Because you can always ship things around, right? You can always ship things around. You can allocate resources effectively. Growth is good.
yeah.
So my point is, you have to understand that the technology tree that we happen to see is the result of a particular ideology. You can't divorce the two. There's a particular kind of foundational story that motivates this way of understanding the world. So that's one part of it. The other thing I wanted to say is, when we're writing about we're doing world building, one of the things that I think we often ignore is the path dependency of technology evolution. The way the US has evolved to do things the way we do is, path dependent. We had this particular push for intercontinental railroads. And those railroads then became the right of way for telecommunications companies to lay telegraph lines and to lay later on internet backbone lines. So the fact that our network, if you think of it as a system of tubes, as a senator famously put it, if you think of it as a set of tubes, these tubes have deep path dependency on our own history. The idea that railroad companies and their right of way would somehow change the way and transform the way we build, modern fiber optic cables is bizarre. But that's how it is. In Europe, Roman roads often determine modern roads. And in East Asia, ancient canals built over 2 millennia ago still have meaning today, even though the canals themselves are no longer found. They leave a mark. So the path dependency of technology is very important, and I think a lot of times what I see when I see sci-fi or fantasy that doesn't feel very thought through. I think oftentimes what I'm missing is the sense of path dependence, the sense of history, the sense that technology is not a rational enterprise that you just do in this platonic, let's design the ideal republic way. It's messy, it's human, it's a story, it's history, it's whose grandparents built that particular fence, which then evolved into this and evolved into that, and now here we are. That kind of messiness is what gives technology texture and reality. Why do we do things in such silly ways? Sometimes we do things that without even understanding it. Why do we build our houses in this particular style? Why is it that Washington D.C. is filled with neoclassical buildings? What is Rome and Corinthian columns have to do with the United States? So bizarre. You have to understand the weird history of how all of this came to be, and I think that's what makes it so deeply interesting to me, the quirkiness. And sometimes people who don't understand the history of it will see world building and they'll just be like, that makes no sense. Well, actually, you know what? the real world often does not
Yeah.
make sense. That's actually
Yeah.
a sign that you have thought through and actually really worked through what it means to have a human enterprise.
And this idea for people writing that they need to think, it doesn't have to be, so you don't have to say it explicitly on the page, but I think as writers, it behooves us to think about where our societies come from, because this American idea that we just sprang fully formed from the head of Zeus, that we aren't connected to the past. If you don't know about the past, then you aren't connected to the past. But of course, that's not true. And it's never been true. And as writers, that's part of our job, to make the reader feel that they're in a world that's grounded not just in this surface layer, but that it goes deeper, that you can maybe catch glimpses of how it's connected to the past. And that technology is, like you, as you say, one of those links.
Right.
Because I do the same thing, Ken. When I read a fantasy novel or a science fiction novel that feels like it's living in the present with no connection, I check out, because I don't believe it.
Right.
It's, I mean, not everybody feels that way, and that's fine. But for me, that's a major thing for me.
One of the great pleasures for me in reading sci-fi and fantasy that has a sense of history about it is to recognize the ways in which we are connected to all humanity, because it turns out that many of our problems are recurring problems that have plagued people in other places and other times. And the fact that, we struggle to solve these problems and we don't have a perfect solution is, to me, not a source of despair, but a source of inspiration. I mean, for example, right? So I will show my my book. This is the third book in the Dynasty.
I'm reaching for that book.
So one of the things that I really enjoyed about working on this series is to having done a lot of research into matters that really that concern me. So the series took a decade to write. So of course, like all works of fiction, they are not so much about another place, another time, as they are about the time we're in and the place we're in.
Yeah.
So, because over the last decade or so, the US in particular has plunged into this very much needed national self-examination about our story. What is the story of America and who gets to tell it? So my epic fantasy ended up being influenced in that sense. And so a lot of these eternal problems that we struggle with, I had to research into how past societies dealt with it. So for example, in the Denton Dynasty, I have this long sections dealing with exactly the things we talked about. How do you control a bureaucracy that's spreading out of control? How do you get the equivalent of Homeland Security, an agency established with a clear goal, from sprawling into areas way beyond its original mandate and arguably not doing the thing it's supposed to do? How do you get that under control? How do you deal with conflicting definitions of meritocracy? How do you have fairness that accounts for the fact that people in different circumstances should not be treated the same? These are eternal problems. They're not unique to us. The ancients had to deal with it too. And part of my joy is to see, how did the Romans deal with these problems? How did the Song Empire deal with these issues? How did classical Korea deal with these issues? How did Japan during the shogunate deal with these issues? Because it turns out that these are all issues that have plagued other societies. Yeah. They're not unique to us. The desire for justice, for equality, for progress, for doing things better than our ancestors, whatever that means, is in fact universal. It recurs throughout in different forms, and it's inspiring to see how other societies have done it. And so, when we can write our fantasy, if we can, I often get this weird sense, which is, sometimes readers of fantasy believe that the past is so different in the sense that they couldn't have understood our problems. Yeah. Somehow issues like equality were not things that the past was concerned about. But I'm just like, wow, many of our arguments about the SAT right now you can find analogs during the Ming Dynasty, because ministers during the Ming Dynasty argued with each other constantly about what is a fair test? How do you have a fair test? How can you have a test that accounts for differences in educational resources? How can you possibly have a fair test when most of the top examinees come from one province? How can that possibly make people think that that's fair? You read these arguments and you're like, these are modern arguments. These are the same arguments we are having. But there are some readers who just don't understand that. Some readers who fail to have a sense of history of this understanding that many of the things we think are unique to us are not. They are manifestations, modern manifestations of ancient human nature issues.
And that's one of the reasons I mentioned, for example, these early, where you would have a town who would say, we're not beholden to any king, because you see that early on. You see assemblies of citizens, which I grant you was generally freeborn men, which is already limiting, but nevertheless, you see these things early on. And when people say, oh, well, they just all believed in the sacrality of kingship. Well, no, maybe some of these kings created that idea that they were anointed. I mean, that's part of the technology of their rule.
That's actually one of the great joys, to go back and look at monarchies, right? Because monarchies are not.
No, they're not
the same. You go back and look at Korea, you look at Vietnam, you look at China, you look at England, France. You go back, and almost every monarchy has its own set of technology for how to constrain the king's power. There's just, it's fascinating to see. Sometimes it's a class of nobles, sometimes it's about a professional bureaucracy. Sometimes it's about a professional elite, not hereditary per se, but rather defined by cultural commitment. But the point is, almost every monarchy evolved internally some set of technologies to constrain power, because the idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely is not a modern revelation. This is something that ancient people had to deal with constantly. How do you solve this problem? And it's just so much fun and interesting and really reassuring to see what people have invented in the past to do this.
So we have a question over here in the Q&A from Gayatri, which is, what's an example of a community-based society and the technologies that are more important there? And I'm going to give a quick one. I read about this in an academic work by a Western scholar, and it's about Indonesia, Bali specifically. So I can't guarantee that it is accurate. First, I want to say that first. And I don't know enough to know. But in any case, in the 60s and 70s, when the Green Revolution happened, and foreigners came into places like Southeast Asia and said, we're going to give you better ways to do agriculture. It will help you not have famines and make everything better for all you people. When they came to Bali, it turned out that the temples in Bali had this very elaborate system of where the temples, according to certain parts of the calendar, would release water for the rice fields at different intervals. It was hundreds and hundreds of years old. Well, what superstition was that, right? So the Westerners sailed in and said, we're going to give you better ways to do this. And so they gave them better ways to do this. And for whatever reason, they went it. And then immediately within a decade or two, the system broke down and they began to have the famines and shortages that they hadn't had before, because it turned out that that whole elaborate temple network had generation upon generation of experience understanding the weather and the fields and who needed what when and how to best give who needed to give the right amounts in the right places. So that's an example.
Another example I would give is much closer to home. If you read Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, it's actually a very wonderful book in so many ways.
Yeah.
But what to me is fascinating is, here's a Frenchman who, a very young person who traveled through America and just decided to give his opinion of what America was about. A lot of things he got wrong, a lot of things he got right, and he was very insightful in a lot of ways. And what's fascinating to me is to read through the descriptions he had of what he thought were the roots of American democracy and how American democracy could function, and his description of the American character. In some
Yeah.
ways, I think de Tocqueville really gave us a really wonderful document of that foundational mythology I was talking about. This is his observation as an outsider of what America's foundational mythology was at the time, as individual citizens understood it. And what strikes out in me is how different that democracy was from the democracy we now have.
Yeah.
In de Tocqueville's time, the most important government for an average American is not Washington, D.C. It's not even the state capital. It's literally the town meeting. The town meeting is one where it's the technology, it's the community-based technology that everyone gathered around and put your voice in. Now, granted, you have to be a certain demographic in order to participate. Enslaved people could not, and women for the most part could not. But if you belong to the quote unquote right demographic, you could participate in a very real way in the most important decisions that affected you right away. That is a very different world from the world we are in, where the federal government now has so much more power than I would argue any of the founders imagined.
Yeah.
This is a very different America from the America that was conceived at the time of the revolution, and the fact that how many people in a large city like Chicago or New York can possibly participate in that town meeting? You know, it's absurd. The modern American democracy is much more of a bureaucratic administrative state than Tocqueville's America was. And the technologies that served that society so well are not the same technologies that we need now and that we can work with. And it's worth thinking about how we evolved to this point. Is this inevitable? You know, is this always what happens to powerful democracies, that they evolve into centralized democratic empires? I don't know. But it is worth thinking about how we got to this point and why we are where we are.
If anyone has any more questions, can you please put them in the Q&A thing, which is over to the right, because neither Ken and I are looking at chat. Oh, Finn wants you to put in your questions. Ken, let me just ask Finn.
Wow, Finn.
Yeah, Finn, come here, buddy. Oh, he's going to start barking now. Anyway, I'm going to ignore him. I want you to talk, since we have a few more minutes left, about technology as an art form.
Oh yeah. Oh man.
You have 5 minutes, Ken.
Okay. So my theory is, it's not original to me, but I really like it, which is that technology is much more like poetry than it is like science. So the theory is that, you know, having worked as an engineer myself, a lot of times engineers don't actually understand why something works in a fundamental sense. They just know that it does work. And a lot of times what engineers do is they take from a set of known solutions and they combine them in various ways to devise something new that solves a problem. The way they go about it is much more like a tinker. They tinker, they play, they tweak things, they experiment, and then they see if it works. It's not really about doing fundamental science. It's not about really fundamentally understanding the way, why, you know, from a basic science perspective, things work the way they do. It's more like, I know this works. It really doesn't matter so much why it works, as I know it works, and this is something you can do to make it solve this problem. It's a lot more intuitive, a lot more artistic, a lot more about poetry than it is about science. And so, you know, engineers, there is something beautiful about the way somebody like Steve Wozniak taking pleasure in the way the boards were laid out in the final assembly. There's something lovely about the way that engineers want to sign their work at the end, because it really is an artwork that they're creating. It's not about finding an aspect about the fundamental nature of the universe. That's science. Technology really is a very independent activity. It's very much more humanistic, and engineers are closer to word people than they are to math people. I think that's a insight that I found, at least in my own practice, that I think is deeply interesting to me. It's you're really crafting a thing. You're really crafting an artistic work at the end, and your relationship to it is very similar to how artists feel about their creation than scientists towards their discoveries.
I think we said technology is the human mind made external.
Yeah, that's how I think.
You said. I'm quoting you.
It's your emanation. It's the way that your vision, your thing, made concrete in the real world. And anybody who has built things, whether it's just a piece of furniture for their own use or a product used by hundreds of millions of people, that's what it is. You're crafting a piece of art, an artifact that you share with the universe. This is my poem. I'm putting it out there, and then I think it's important to see that and to think about that way.
I like seeing that separation of technology and science and how they are two very different processes. I have a question from Jenny. What's a strategy to turn current events, current technology, or extrapolate tech advances into mythologies for more futuristic science fiction?
Wow, that is so cool.
That's a great
I love
question.
that question. I mean, if you figure out a solution that works in the general sense, you should totally give a seminar on that. I don't do anything that grandiose, but I do think that one thing that has helped me in terms of writing stories, extrapolating about technology that make me, happy and feel like I'm doing something interesting, is to look into the stories that the inventors themselves are telling about the technology, as well as the stories users of the technology are telling. So, for example, Tim Berners-Lee had a particular narrative about what the web was about. If you look at his old papers and what he said, he had a particular vision of what the web was and how he wanted to be used. And then you read about, Instagram stories and what the Kardashians are doing with Instagram and how they conceive of this technology. You can see that the two are different yet the same. There is a mythological thread that connects the two, even though they manifest in such superficially different ways. What that tells me is the inventor of technology can almost never predict the specific manifestation of how that technology will be used. They can tell in a very generic sense what human quality they wish to amplify, but exactly how that will play out, they don't really know. And I would say that if you go back to see what Mark Zuckerberg wrote early on about Facebook, or the Facebook, as he called it, and then see, what the Capitol riot participants were saying about social media. These are also two very different stories about technology, but there is, again, a mythological thread that connects them. And I think that's what's so fascinating, that the same myth that can lead to wonderful, wonderful things can also lead to horrible things, because it's just about amplifying the human potential. That's all that technology can do. It just amplifies your potential to do both good and terrible things. Interesting speculation always comes from thinking about both. I don't think it's very interesting to think only about the terrible things people will do with the technology. It's also interesting to think about the wonderful things people can do. And it's in that contrast where the story really happens. I mean, like any great mythology, you need the titans, and you need the gods as well as the giants, and they go to their final battle, and we are there to cheer them on.
Yeah, I'm not going to add anything to that. It was a perfect answer, Ken. We have one more question. We have like 1 minute. So this is going to be fast because it's another great question. What are your thoughts from Carol? What are your thoughts about dealing with the loss of technology and the impact on society after an apocalypse has wiped out most electronics? But this again gets to mythologies. It's the narrative of what the past life was and what's left. That's one way to look at it. What else?
I love to look at actual stories of loss in the past. There was a period of time, for example, when Japan, for a period of time, adapted the use of modern firearms, and then for hundreds of years, they decided to abandon it. And it's fascinating to think about, to look into that history and see why the decision was made and how it was made and why. Similarly, you can look into the history of agriculture, why certain crops were adapted and then abandoned, and how people adapt to climate change, literally by shifting the new agricultural products they've adapted. And then it's that sense of loss and why a loss may not necessarily be a loss. I know that's confusing, but sometimes you abandon things in order to make forward motion.
I think another way to look at it, I think it's also useful to study the collapse of empires, because in general, you have an empire which usually has a centralized governmental focus. And when empires collapse, what happens is it breaks down into localized communities again. And what happens? So they will lose the benefits of that centralized empire and the power that it had. But and there will be disadvantages to that in different communities. But as Ken said, there may also be advantages to localized rule. One of the classic things when you look at, again, Europe, I did so much research on Europe for Crown of Stars, is that in times of, in a patriarchal society, in times of decentralized rule, you tend to see more women in prominent positions. And as the rule centralizes towards a patriarchal hierarchy, you'll see they'll still be there, but they're not as prominent, and because they may not have as many opportunities. And women would just be one example. So it's read the history of things that have gone on. And I think that gives a good way to look at it. We're gonna have to go because it's noon. We're done. Thank you, Ken. That was fabulous. Thank you for all of you who are here. There is a writing, Charlie Jane Anders is available in another room at SFWA events, at the Nebula SFWA events, for those who want to go there. What's coming out? Okay, so Rebecca Roanhorse will be with me on March 21st to talk about archaeoastronomy and the cosmology of a world.
It is so cool.
Yeah, I can't wait, because we're both like total archaeoastronomy geeks, it turns out. And in April, Nyla Magruder, who is both a writer and an illustrator, is going to talk about the visible and tangible as detail. That will be April 18th. Again, thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. Thank you to Nathan, who oversees this. Thank you to all of you who were here. I hope to see you. And thank you to anyone who's watching this on the YouTube channel when it will be released in a week. You can tell my professional hosting duties are now over.
All right, enjoy, everyone.
Bye.